Hello everyone and welcome to Top 5, a new series where I'm going to be taking a look at a specific subject and give you my top 5 tips of how to improve your game. Today we're going to have a look at Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, heir to the Baron's throne, both a cruel but cunning man, and this is indeed reflected in Uprising, and makes for a surprisingly diverse leader on the battlefield. So my first tip for Feyd is that looks can be deceiving, and yes, the irony is not lost on me at all. At first glance, Feyd does look like a very heavy sort of battle leader, with what we know of Feyd of the source material, but the fact, you've got his ability to add extra strength into combat, and his ring can definitely throw a lot of scare and fear into your opposition. But it turns out that Feyd can actually change his plans pretty effectively midway. He can go very faction heavy, looking to focus on that, or even go into a deck building route here, which means that Feyd kind of almost but not quite turns into the all-rounder that Paul Atreides was in the first game, in a very strange sort of juxtaposition. But it can also mean that if there's no obvious route on drafting to go for a specific battle strategy, or the cards on the Imperium row are okay but nothing too exciting, maybe Feyd-Rautha's the way to go. Feyd can be a way to kind of sort of let the game peter out a little bit here, go for a couple of rounds before really committing to your strategy, and then going for a late game charge. So let's look at Feyd's passive. Devious Strength, being able to lift up any spy sent onto the board for 2 extra swords for combat on your reveal turn. Now this is actually pretty tricky ability for your opponents to deal with, but it does have different values, I think. In the early game, this can be very strong. Again, you can have a spy on literally any spot on the map, be it faction, be it desert, be it high council, wherever you want. You can lift any single one of them on your reveal turn for those 2 swords, and that can be very key early on when resources are limited, when decks aren't filled with heavy sword cards. Those 2 swords can make it very easy for you to snipe those early battle victories and get your game going, especially if you've got combats that, say, pair with your initial starting symbol. But just as strong as adding those 2 swords to your initial conflict value is the fear and threat that you're going to do so. And this is what makes Feyd very tricky in the early game. If you can get that spy down early, be it with your ring or another way of achieving that, you, of course, don't have to reveal the spy for the 2 swords, and you might decide not to commit any forces at all. This is where Feyd can be really tricky in the first couple of rounds and can force your opponents to have to overcommit heavy. You can kind of see how the ground lies and then take advantage of that. So while you can definitely reveal it for the strength, you don't feel forced to. Other thing that you got to bear in mind as well is that as the game develops, people get hold of bigger garrisons and stronger cards. That devious strength tends to lose a bit of its bite a little bit later on in the game. Those 2 swords can definitely still make the difference in like a round 7 or round 8 tier 3 conflict, but you can't expect this to carry you the whole way. You're going to need something else to supplant this, and of course your spies might end up having other uses, be it with cards, intrigues, and the like. Just bear in mind that that spy cost is not particularly cheap either. That gives you access, guaranteed access to spaces you might want to hit, factions, a point, shipping, high council, that sort of thing. So by revealing that spy to get those 2 troops, it's a nice intrinsic cost at that point, but you do also have to think a little bit about your longer game and make sure you're not just completely crippling yourself for access for the sake of getting from a 3rd place reward to a 2nd. It might not really be worth it. So next up, let's have a look at Feyd's Ring. It's quite a diverse ability, personal training, and is the only ability in all of Dune Imperium where you can kind of personalize your rewards and decide how you actually want to take your progress in the game. You use your ring to move a cube which starts on the leftmost side of this track, 1 to the right, and you simply follow the path along with a couple of spots where you can choose what reward it is that you desire. Now, what you're going to see in the majority of your games is people taking the spies to Feyd-Rautha, especially in the first step or 2. It makes Feyd-Rautha the best person in the entire game to start getting spies on those very important faction spots immediately. There is another leader who can also produce spies wherever he wants, being Staban, but his spies have got other things to be doing. So Feyd is a fantastic leader if you want to be like guaranteeing yourself access to liver supplies so you can look to threaten deep desert and get to shipping. Feyd also is very effective. Maybe you're out of position but you want to get your mega hooked. Well, get a spy over to the Fremen so that you can get your friendship going to get to Siege and get to hooks. Feyd could also even go down a more deck building style route. Get the spy and espionage, which there are several leaders in the game that really want this spot. So it guarantees you access to espionage. You spend the spy to infiltrate, well, that's fine. I'll just go and put that straight back on. So you can see here how Feyd's spy abilities can give you a ton of flexibility in the mid game, and you can kind of tweak your strategy to whatever you need. Another thing to consider with Feyd is taking your spy and heading over to the Landsraad Council with it as well. This is another very important spy location right here. If you can put this here, you're guaranteeing yourself access to Swordmaster, and then what you're kind of waiting to do is for someone else, say in the early game, to get that I-8 Solari by the Swordmaster. Well, now not only can you guarantee yourself access to it, you also get it cheaper too. So this can be a really nice way of setting yourself up to get that Swordmaster like a round 3 when you're in a bit of a tricky position, and allow yourself to build on the action economy. So ton of use for Feyd's Ring. The one thing I would quickly say, however, before we move on though, is don't sleep on the trash routes either, especially this one up here. Paying a coin for a trash is not the most fashionable, coming from an XMO background where you want to get that Solari ASAP to get your Swordmaster and get that third action, which of course is very important. But there are times where that trash is just going to be more important for you than the spy. Especially, say, if the opening conflict's got a load of money, well, suddenly you've got the funds to be able to pay for that. It can also mean that if you're sort of in a weird spot and a lot of your access got blocked up in the first round, well, all of a sudden, Feyd-Rautha, an early trip, say, to Spice Refinery, picking up that loose Solari, well, suddenly it's not so bad. Instead of Spice Refinery for 2 Solaris, it's a Solari and a trash. Suddenly it doesn't sound too bad, does it? As for the second part of the track, it's kind of up to you. Personally, I prefer trying to take the bottom route where possible for the spy and the 2 spies, which is really nice. But do bear in mind, it's a little bit of a slower trip. It's 2 steps instead of 1. And you do want to make sure that by the end of the game, you're hitting that final spot there. That troop and spy, round 6, round 7, people are desperately clawing their way to win fights and battles to get access where they need to, can be absolutely key and essential. So the fourth tip here is going to be about seat positioning. Again, this is something that has become more and more important, I think, to a lot more players, and where you want to sit with specific leaders. Feyd-Rautha occupies an interesting spot where he probably has some definite synergy with starting in a later position in the initial fight. Because you've got devious strength and because you can throw in those extra 2 swords, that can be really scary for your opposition. Now, of course, this does mean that you need to have your ring, and that you need to put your spy down with your ring in order to actually go ahead and get those +2 swords. Of course, you're not always going to draw your ring. Half the time, you're not ever going to find it. But the problem is for your opponents is that they simply don't know when that 50% is going to be. And the thing is, of course, if you're last person to act, they are never going to know if you've got your ring or not. And again, because Feyd can make better use of places like Haggard Base and Spice Refinery than anyone else can at the start of the game, it can make this really tricky for your opponents and put them in some very uncomfortable spots. But truthfully, Feyd is also pretty good in pretty much any seat here because of the fact that he is surprisingly versatile in how you play him, and it's someone that I probably should look to use a lot more than I actually do. If you want to go for a specific card, you're going for a more deck building route, well, sitting first or second seat's totally fine. If you can use your spy to look to get hold of throw-in access, second seat looks pretty good. If you want to go deliver supplies, deep desert, and shipping for early Swordmaster, you can kind of do that as well. So Feyd-Rautha is someone that I think is totally fine in all positions. Having him in the back seats probably has a slight bit of extra spice because of devious strength, but you're not always going to be wanting to use that spy for the battle power. Just having that spy down on a faction you need to get to early can be just off as much, if not more valuable. So it's time for tip number 5, my wildcard tip. And for Feyd, it's kind of twofold particularly. First off, you want to make sure that you respect Feyd-Rautha's ring. It's very important to him that you're getting that off as much as possible because the abilities and stuff to gain on his tracks here are very strong. So something you've got to bear in mind of is that if you don't have the ring in hand, you've got to always be a little bit conscious and thinking about what happens if, say, on your last action you go to Arakeen or something, or you go to Espionage and you draw your ring, and then suddenly you can't use it, and it goes to your discard, and you don't draw it again for a while, that can be very, very damaging for Feyd-Rautha. So it's something you've got to bear in mind. Don't go crazy heavy on drawing in your last action if you think it's very likely. If you've got, like, say, 3 cards left in your draw pile, one of them is your ring, maybe you're better off finding another action. If it's not as effective immediately, having that use of the ring the next round is obviously incredibly important. And the other thing I would definitely mention for Feyd is make sure you've got spies on the board at all times. It's obviously good for devious strength, and always threatening those 2 swords. And having a little bit of a garrison force in hand means you're always threatening to come in over the top of people. If you've got no intention of doing so, it can make people have to spend more. And psychologically, they're just terrified that you're going to strip away a really important key combat for them. But of course, also having those spies in that generation is going to be useful for you as well. And just past generation, well, it makes cards like Wheels Within Wheels, Benny Operative, and Covert Operation. Even with these cards here with this spy generation, just passively, for some leaders, might not be too good, but for Feyd-Rautha and those +2 swords can be incredibly dangerous. And that's just talking about them. That's not even getting into the likes of Subversives of course, Public Spectacle, which, of course, is an absolute beast of a card. And in Feyd's hands things can get really ugly. And so that is my top 5 for Feyd-Rautha. Hopefully we'll use these tips and tricks to go ahead and improve your game. Of course, if you like what we do here, we have got more coming for the top 5 series here on Hidden Assets. And if you're able to follow and support us on the channel, we'd hugely, hugely appreciate that. But other than that, thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.